Well, thank you. Thanks very much for coming out tonight. I'm always glad to do these meetings, especially Vancouver Historical Society. I'm sure you're all members. If you're not, you should join. There's this organization does some really great work and some really interesting meetings, and it's very worth being a part of. So I'm honored to be here to talk. I haven't actually been here since I spoke for on the Penthouse book, Liquor, Lust, and Law, that I did. So what I'm going to do tonight is read a few portions of the book out. Talk a little bit how the book came together, and show some photographs and some stuff I haven't shown before. This is a unique, I've done a number of sort of presentations since the book's come out. This is the first time that there are some people from the book here tonight, both from the retired police community and the retired gang community, probably is the best way to put it, or whatnot. So, and maybe they'll join me for some Q&A later on, hopefully, or something like that. So, but the book came together in an interesting way. In 2011, I was writing for the Vancouver Courier and writing a number of articles and whatnot, and I did a story that came out that year about the history of gangs in Vancouver. And in 2011, it was an interesting time because back then there were a number of gang shootings that were being reported at the time. And they were happening within the city. So often, a lot of the gang crime that we hear about in contemporary society happens out in Surrey or Abbotsford. There's not as much happening in the city. There are certainly those incidents that take place and shootings and things that occur in town. But for the most part, Vancouver is a city that deals with gang crime in the outskirts of the city. And the article spoke to some retired police and talked to people who lived in East Vancouver who had dealt with some of the park gang era in the 1970s and whatnot. The only thing it didn't have is actually any gang members in the article, which I sort of lamented. And so often is the case when you write one of these things and it finally comes out, then you get contacted by people. More people said, "Oh, had I known you were working on this story, I would have contacted you and given you this or that." Or there's always these sort of interesting tidbits that come out. And one day at the Courier, the receptionist flags me and says, "There's an old gang member on the phone that wants to talk to you about your article." And I thought, "Oh God, what have I said? Or what sort of trouble am I in?" And it turned out to be this gentleman, Mac Ryan, who was involved with the Clark Park gang in the 1970s, and a real warehouse of East Vancouver history, and was a really sort of fun and humorous guy to talk to, quite frankly, because he spoke very sort of colorfully about those days. Now, he had a checkered past, and he wasn't apologetic about any of that, but he was able to sort of put a lot of things into context for me that I don't think I had been necessarily aware of before. For those of you not really familiar maybe with East Vancouver, since we're out here on the cushy west side, where I grew up, the Clark Park is, of course, out at about 14th and Commercial. It's a very large park. I think it's the second largest park next to Stanley Park in the city for many, many years. I think that's been eclipsed maybe by the way that they expanded Queen Elizabeth Park. But a lot of the focus of this story and the events I'm going to talk about tonight all focus around 1972. There's a lot of before and after, but specifically that. East Vancouver back in the 1970s, by way of show of hands, I'm curious to know how many people here are born and raised in Vancouver? There we go. Now, if you're newer to Vancouver, and let's say you moved here past 1986, show of hands. There's a few. Now, growing up, for me, growing up in the 1970s, I was very aware, as many probably of you were who were here before 1986, and 1986 is often used as a benchmark in Vancouver because of Expo, because of the city before and after. I think actually in the last 20 years, there's even been more changes necessarily since Expo, so that Expo demarcation is not necessarily the best date to use necessarily. But there used to be sort of two Vancouvers. It doesn't so much happen anymore, but there was the west side of Vancouver and East Van. And in the 60s and 70s in East Vancouver, it was a remarkably different, sort of two different societies. I know many people who grew up in West Van that never went to East Vancouver, and probably a little bit from the back and forth. What I mean to say is that for many, many years, we don't have that anymore because there's $1 million homes in East Van just like there are in Kerrisdale, if not more pricey now. So that the city's affluence has changed in just a relatively short few years. What the makeup of Vancouver and what the sort of the demographics and the economic situations are like. Now, the homes that used to be occupied in East Vancouver by, let's say, warehouse workers or dock workers and whatnot, are now lived in and owned by film technicians and web designers and hairdressers and any number else. There's not that necessarily there was a blue collar end of town that had been a little rougher. And this is just not anecdotal evidence either. There were homes in East Vancouver in the late 1960s and early 1970s that were being sold for what they were worth in the 1910s. There are many areas that it was because of the Georgia Viaduct that were sort of going to be considered all going to be demolished, so banks wouldn't lend homeowners money to fix up their homes. And there was a real sort of different, as I say, a real different demarcation between the east side and the west side of Vancouver. And many people who grew up in East Vancouver homes didn't necessarily grow up with the same kind of luxuries, shall we say, as people in the west side of the city. So many people of the book and many of the kids that grew up in East Vancouver that sort of fell afoul of the law ended up at this building here, which is gone. And we probably should sort of applaud that it's gone, because even by the point when this photograph was taken I think in the mid-60s, it was long sort of past its prime. This was the Juvenile Detention Hall that was once up at Wall Street in Penticton, just sort of up Burrardview Park. The building on the far right, pardon me, is still there, and it's a cancer hospice building now, I believe it is. But the larger building, imposing building there on the left was the Juvenile Detention Hall, and I'll read a little bit about that here. One of the people I spoke with about the Juvenile Detention Hall was a provincial court judge by the name of Thomas Gove, and who now he's involved with the community court, still as an acting judge, but in the early 1970s he was a family court lawyer, and he talks about working there back then. When I first started to practice law, I spent nearly every day there, says Provincial Court Justice Tom Gove, who in his career specialized in the area of family law. Gove recalls that delinquents housed there who faced charges would be escorted by university student-age guards through a tunnel that connected to the cells of the JDH courthouse. They were young, athletic guys, some of them football players, just in jeans and t-shirts. They weren't staff from BC Corrections. They had no uniforms, and nobody had any guns or anything like that. They brought the accused kids into the courtroom, usually a few at a time, lining them up on a low bench, like a basketball team on the sidelines, he says. Also noting that none of the youths were ever handcuffed, even though some of them were charged with robberies and violent crimes. Occasionally, one of them would try and run away, and when they did, one of the guards would have to run out of the courtroom to chase after him, Gove says. One day I was there for a case, and the kid ran, just bolted from the front door, and one of the guards chased and tackled him outside the parking lot. The kid got a little bloodied up, getting tackled, and wanted to go to the hospital, but the guards just dusted him off, told him he was fine, and marched him back in the courthouse. It was a pretty vivid and interesting scene there. For those found guilty, the links to their sentences, and I should say this wasn't a holding thing for the courthouse, this was where people were kept, or juvenile delinquents were kept. The links of the sentence were often based on how long the young offenders became adults. Therefore, it didn't always matter what the crime was. You could potentially be sent away for years. And Gove explained, so if you were caught shoplifting at age 13, you theoretically could remain in custody unless the staff had determined you had reformed, until you turned an adult, which at that time was considered age 21. I guess they figured it was good to keep them there for a few years, Gove said, shaking his head incredulously. Not many who got sentenced that young had to remain jailed for years, but it could, and it did happen. The delinquents necessarily received unnecessary long sentences. As for the young males in juvenile detention, a lot of them were for burglaries, fighting, or stealing cars, Gove says. But these weren't kids chopping up the cars for parts to resell or sending them on freighters for overseas profit. These were stealing cars to commit a robbery with them, or just going for joyrides. I remember one kid who was there off and on quite a bit for stealing cars and then driving them off the edge of a cliff or a ravine just to see the cars crash at the bottom. So this wasn't organized crime, it was just crime or violence for the sake of doing it. Gove admits by the early 70s, it was quite commonly accepted by those who worked around the courts that JDH was an archaic institution. It began to be viewed as an unacceptable place to house delinquents. But for those who experienced a disruptive life at home, the JDH would often be perceived as a welcome respite. I can still remember my first morning there, recalls Mac Ryan. After they got us up, I went down to the cafeteria for breakfast. At home, all I had was shitty powdered milk and lousy food. But there on each table, they had big pitchers of real milk, real homogenized milk, he laughs. There are 4 different types of cereal, toast and jam and apples and oranges. I couldn't believe it. I ate a bowl of cereal and pushed my bowl away, figuring that was all we were allowed to have. And the kid next to me says, have some more. I said, holy shit, you're allowed to have more? Lunch was good, dinner was beautiful. But when he was released, at home, life had not improved. And Ryan repeatedly found himself being sent back to juvenile detention. Because the food, maybe because the food was good, I kept subconsciously going back, Ryan jokes. But for years, a pattern of running home, crashing with friends, and after getting arrested for a new string of burglaries and offensives, being sent back to the JDH. I practically grew up there. It was like my second home. I stopped counting after 20 times. Between the ages of 12 and 17, I must have been sentenced there 25 times. So there's a humorous side, of course, that Mac talks about there, but the reality is some of these kids were remarkably underserved. If you grew up in this world, or you grew up in a home where parents were in a broken home, all the sort of telltale signs, parents may be addicted to have alcoholism issues, immediately those kids aren't going to get off to the best foot in the world. I'm not making any excuses in my estimation or anything like that, but many of these people can rise to great things in life, and they have. But they're already starting at a -1 that, frankly, wasn't seen by many kids in Vancouver on the west side of town. The nature of gangs and the word gang is a interesting thing. We use the word gang for everything from our gang comedy and whatnot to organized crime and the mafia and whatnot. But as Gove was saying, that the juvenile gangs weren't necessarily organized crime. There was disorganized crime, and could almost be sort of more violent. Your chances of perhaps meeting and crossing a gang member today are a little bit remote, unless you sort of go looking for trouble. But back then, there were certainly areas of town, or certain times at night, or certain areas that you had to watch your step, especially if you're not from that neighborhood. And many Vancouverites of a certain age will recall, being in maybe one part of town late at night and not maybe knowing where they were and encountering some of the park gangs. And goes back to a time, excuse me, when juvenile youth, in a lot of cases, it was easier to hang out with your friends rather than when mom and dad were drunk at home, and you would hang out with your friends down at the park. There's been a number of different gangs in Vancouver go back almost to the beginning of the city. One of the first year of newspapers that ever came out in Vancouver talked about a gang that was active in the city robbing homes and whatnot. So we've always dealt with them. And there's been different kinds of gangs, and as the decades have gone past, each decade blames the gang of yesteryear, not being as bad as the gangs are today. Each year, each decade that goes by, they say that's worse than the previous ones around. In the 1920s, there was a sort of corner lounge gang. These kids in the corner that would be harassing people or maybe stealing from stores and things like this. Pretty petty stuff. By the 1940s, you have these stories of the Zoot Suit gangs and whatnot. In the 50s, the sort of Switchblade era gangs and the hot rod things. Again, the newspaper reports say that today's crop of gangsters and these street gangs are worse than the generation before them. This article from 1965 in the newspaper talked about how the city and police were dealing with a juvenile delinquent problem in parks, in city parks. And this isn't just East Vancouver. There was a Dunbar Park gang, almost a Bobolink Park. All over the city, there's these stories of juvenile youth gangs sort of happening in those and hanging around parks and whatnot. This is a photo of some guys from the Riley Park gang. I just found out today the dog's name is Tex. Somebody emailed me today about that. This is from a Vancouver Sun photo and whatnot. The guys are I think, posing for the camera a little bit, acting tough. But you can get a sort of an idea of what was around back then. But slowly but surely, in the 1960s and early 70s, you have these stories about how gangs of juvenile delinquents are becoming more and more of a problem in Vancouver. The Seafest riot, that happened, that was blamed partly. Now there were a lot of people just down there drunk and going berserk, but again, the police are blaming, teams of gangs. Again, often unorganized. So there was a leader of these things, as some of the in the book, as some of the gang members will express. They never sat down and had boardroom meetings and say, okay, what are you going to do today? I'm going to take care of this, and you take care of that. Nothing like that was going on. This isn't, as I say, organized crime, but disorganized crime in that sense. And at the time, of course, you have Mayor Tom Campbell, sort of a great figure, and there's all sorts of interviews that you can watch of him online blaming a scum generation of Vancouver that's causing problems, and he sort of blamed not only the hippies and whatnot, but the greasers, and these were sort of two very diametrically opposed sort of groups of people. But it was all the same to him, and he was, famous for bulldozing buildings. I think almost anybody in the Vancouver history and heritage community would love to sort of grab the ghost of Tom Campbell by the scruff of the neck for some of the stuff that he did and proposed. Like, none of it all came to pass. But we forget, however, there were a lot of people that agreed with him. There were a lot of people who felt that, the world was sort of coming apart, and the kids that were coming up today had no respect for authority or anything like this. So it's a different world. June 3rd, 1972, at the Pacific Coliseum. For the princely sum of $6, you could see the Rolling Stones. I can guarantee you, if the Rolling Stones come back and do a tour here, it'll be more than $6, even for the worst seats in the nosebleeds. But at that event, this sometimes gets referred to as the coming out party for the Clark Park gang. At that instant, you could have gone inside and seen the Stones there apparently it was a great show inside. And had you been inside, you would have no idea that outside the arena, there were thousands of people that didn't get in, that were hoping to sort of storm the doors to get in. There were a number of fake tickets that had been printed and sold. Some of them by some of the scalpers that were selling them that day. Out in front of the arena. And you can see behind on the gentleman there with the white helmets and ties and sticks. That's the Vancouver Riot Squad at the time. Now the Vancouver Riot Squad were already brought down and they were prepared. Now this is about less than a year after the Gastown riot. And the interesting thing is they were largely looked back as two different things. Vancouver loves to riot. Everybody knows that. Interesting enough, we only riot in good weather. The riots that happen in Vancouver's history have only happened in the spring and summer months. By fall, we stop rioting, and it just doesn't happen. Winter, I can't find a single riot that happened in the winter ever in Vancouver. So we cherish those summer, fine weather months to not only go out and see some sun and get some exercise, but also to riot here in Vancouver. The Stones riot, there was, at that night when they opened the doors of the concert, a number of people tried to storm in, and the Vancouver Riot Squad was involved in a massive altercation that night. There were a number of officers, about 30 or 40, I think, officers injured in that riot. It's interesting to see the Riot Squad guys have ties. And the equipment seems so lo-fi in comparison today. Those ties were actually breakaway ties. So if you had the guts to grab a police officer by his tie and pull it, you'd quickly just have the tie in your hand and have to deal with the repercussions. You could see the guys in the Mac jackets there, the East Van Tuxedo, as some people like to call it, or whatever. And very often the case was the Clark Park gang seemed to get a sort of associated that they were exclusive. But in fact, Mac jackets were popular with sort of everybody around that time, so it wasn't exclusively then. This was a photo from the Vancouver Sun Archives, as was this famous photo. There are a couple of officers in the room here tonight, retired police constables who might speak later if there's a question for them or anything like that, but who were there that night and recall the noise and the fury. One thing, as one of them was telling me, that one thing you don't see from the photos or any of the news reports or sometimes even the audio of that somebody may have recorded or the film or news footage is just how loud it was. And many of the guys remember this as one of the sort of most violent nights they've ever being on the job. As I say, a number of police were arrested. And other detachments of RCMP were brought in, as was the mounted squad and whatnot. And the interesting thing was, as I say, in correlation and the difference from the Gastown riot, which had happened where the police were largely castigated for their what was considered an overly aggressive approach, and they stormed in. There was something different done with the media. Whereas at the Gastown riot, the media were on Water Street and right in the middle of it, and were part of the crowd that was charged by police. At the Rolling Stones riot at the Coliseum, the media was invited to stand on the riot squad lines with the riot squad. So the media was getting pelted by rocks as much as the police were, and the coverage was far more sympathetic to the Vancouver Police Department because of that. Now, another thing is that the riot squad was told to be held back for a long time. So while the officers were getting pelted with rocks, while even Molotov cocktails were being thrown at police cars, and a number of these guys getting injured and having been carried off, it took a long time in the wake of, I think, all the attention that the Gastown riot had for the order to finally be given that the police could charge in, and it was over actually quite quickly at that point. But in the wake of that, this is a photo from the Vancouver Police Museum files. The police department that night of the riot went out, and a guy in plainclothes, probably dressed in a MAC jacket himself, went out with a camera and was taking pictures of people in the riot. And these photos typically would be used for a criminal investigation afterwards, identifying some of the rock throwers and things like this. I like the guy in the middle there. He looks like he should be in a heavy metal parking lot or something like that. But a number of officers were, as I say, injured in that riot, and the police department knew they had to do something about it. Now, as much as the book and the story in the book talks about the history of East Vancouver and some of the park gang problems, it's also, I like to think a book about the Vancouver Police Department at the time, and specifically how different the job was then. Administratively, in terms of how people were arrested, this is of course before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and a little bit more sort of Wild West era of policing, where there was a lot more individual responsibility, it seems, given to specific, to the constables on the beat and whatnot. If a constable felt somebody should get a kick in the ass and sent on his way, you couldn't do that today. There's too many people with cell phone cameras probably and whatnot that would film it. But there was a different attitude and a different sense of policing that went around then. And even the job itself was a lot less sort of low tech and whatnot. There's one of the police constables in the book, a gentleman by the name of Esko Kajander, talks about that. Kajander entered the world of policing at a time when technology played far less of a role in the job than it does today. The 1970s police equipment was comparatively rudimentary. While constables had radios in their police cars on their beats, they needed to carry large walkie-talkie radios. Kajander's first beat was on Granville Street downtown, where this photo is taken. If he encountered suspects or noticed suspicious activity, he would take down names by hand in a notebook. Later, you'd go for a coffee break and use the cafe phone to call for a criminal record check on the names, Kajander explains. There was a VPD criminal records office, but it was closed at night. So most of the time, you had to call the RCMP crime index at the old post office building at 15th and Main. They had giant Rolodexes there, and they could look up a record for you and give you extra information over the phone or compare dates of birth to make sure you had the right person. If you wanted a photo, they could mail the black and white photo to you, which you'd pick up at the police station the next day, and that's how we had to do it back then. In fact, one of the officers I spoke to recalled the first time they had a computer in the car, and when they ran a license plate number and it came back 5 seconds later, they hit the computer because they thought something was wrong with it. They simply didn't believe that, because prior to this you had to call and somebody would look at these file cabinets and this and that, see if the car was stolen. So a very different era of policing as well, and it's important to, I think, have a sense of that when it comes to this time. So in the wake of the Rolling Stones riot, about 2 days later, it was decided, it's not exactly certain who perhaps initiated the order, And I wonder if, I imagine the Mayor Campbell was aware of it. Certainly police brass were aware of it. An organization was formed with about a dozen officers called the H Squad, and for the Heavy Squad. There was an official task force group, Parks and Youth Task Force as well. But, and they got 12 of the younger officers, usually pretty burly guys, as you can see. Not all of them are necessarily there. Certainly number 16 on the end there, John Flayton on the far left there was one of the bigger guys. And these guys were sent in undercover into Clark Park to go after the gang. It was simply decided that arresting these guys for petty things wasn't enough, and a more aggressive response was needed. Now, the media was never alerted to this at the time. There are a lot of people in the department that not necessarily knew about it at the time. It was essentially quite a confidential task force put together. And as the H Squad went out and began to do its work, picking up some of the members of the gang, arresting them, there was a number of different things that happened to them that I get into the book. It was believed by people in East Vancouver that it was off-duty police officers acting as vigilantes, when in fact this was a sanctioned thing. Their records of the H Squad are almost impossible to find. I interviewed a couple of the gentlemen that were involved in the H Squad for the book, and they talked about it. This photo, where you could see some of the guys in the photo were smiling. This is sort of a joke photo where they sort of posed as in their own sort of mugshot. I don't know the whole story about it, but I hope to find out maybe one day about it. But as I say, these guys were sent into the park at night. They usually never identify themselves as police. As one Clark Park gang member told me, they didn't have to. It was pretty obvious who they were. And they kicked some ass, for lack of a better expression. Of course, it didn't always pay off. Initially, it certainly scared and maybe scared isn't the right word, pushed the gang out of the park, that they stopped hanging around there in the immediate thing. But then, of course, the H Squad went after some of the gang members in their individual homes or their parents' homes. Occasionally, the tactics backfired. One Clark Parker, Mark Owens, recalls being picked up one night at the park by the squad. Some B&E had just happened in the area, so they went down to grab whoever they could grab, he says dismissively. They took me down to the Fraser River, threw me in, and took off. I was so far away from the park, I had to steal a car just to get home. Now, June 23rd, this is just the same month as the Rolling Stones riot. There was a party up at 58th and Fraser. And that night, a number of people were arrested. And the H Squad, members of the H Squad responded to that incident. The gentleman on the far right there, Esko Kajandra, the quote I just mentioned, the police officer that was working on Granville Street, he was in these photos. When I was doing research for the book, the Vancouver Police Museum contacted me and said, "We've got these photos in a file, I just sort of came across it. I think it's some of the guys you're looking for or you're doing research on, because the file at the bottom says Project H, and there's a bunch of guys getting arrested in MAC jackets and stuff like this." And I said, "Yeah, send them on over to me and let me have a look." And I got the photos, and by this point I'd been talking to some of the members in the gang, and I said I emailed them off to the police, and I emailed them off to some of the former Clark Park gang members. And the police were helpful because they said, "Oh yeah, that's John, that's this and that." And they identified some people. That's Pat, that's et cetera, et cetera. And I sent the photos off to some of the gang members and said, "I don't know if you recognize these guys." And Danny Mouse Williamson says, "Well, that's me in the photo." And Mouse is here tonight as a special guest. Of course, now I had the story of that night. The benefit was that I just didn't have the photos. I had people that had been there and could tell me, exactly what happened. And here's a photo. That's John Flayton again from the H Squad. This lad seems to have peed himself. I think he's a little afraid of flating there, or what, or maybe just what his parents are going to do when they come down and pick him up at the jail. I don't know. But and Jerry Gavin's. Jerry Gavin's one of the most well-known of the Clark Park gang, and remembered by many police at the time. His mother was one of the most well-known heroin dealers in the Commercial Drives area as well, just off 4th and Commercial, where she dealt out of the family home. July 15th, again 6 weeks after the Rolling Stones riot, there's been enough sort of incidents happening where people in East Vancouver believe that the police are cracking down on them. Parents are supportive of their kids, are complaining about the police department being aggressively going after whether these guys are on duty or not. And this event, the Clark Park Freedom Rally, is staged in Clark Park, and a number of these flyers were distributed. Actually, one of the gentlemen who was on the H Squad had a copy of this flyer, and he had saved it, so he'd given it to me. And there were a bunch of bands that played, and there was some community activists who spoke and whatnot, and the press came down to take these photographs and this and that. So within a month or so of, as I say, the H Squad becoming active and going after the gang and going after as a youth gang task force in a way that had never really been done before. The members of the community are starting to complain and started to rally and get together. And the interesting thing is, you probably had some parents that were actually quite happy that their kid was getting a kick in the ass for whatever it was. But there were many parents that simply sided and were also fairly anti-establishment themselves, and didn't want the police to have anything to do with their families, and thought they were being overly aggressive. Again, it's a period of the times in the 60s and 70s that's happening. If you're in Vancouver at the time, you wouldn't have known necessarily that a gang war between police and the Clark Park gang was, in fact, beginning to happen. There were very few incidents. If you go through any kind of some of the files on police history, the Clark Park gang are just sort of mentioned as phantoms almost, and you have to wonder whether they exist or not, or some of the information about this has never really been before told. And in the book, finally, because there were police interviewed and some of the gang members interviewed, finally I think we have the story. But every once in a while, in the summer of 1972, these incidents start sort of beginning to come out. And there was a fight between, there were two constables, Robson and McClellan there, who responded to a call of men fighting, and when they pulled up at the incident to break up the fight, a bunch of other guys jumped over the fence to fight them and to try and beat up the police. Now, it seems unconscionable today that you try and do this. I mean, I don't think they were, but as a product of the time, it seemed like that was the sort of the attitude against police that were and not only that was happening in East Vancouver, because now the Clark Park gang were trying to fight back. There was sort of police intel that they were staging incidents to draw police in to combat them and stuff like this. All of this is happening in the summer of 1972. Again, if you lived here, and maybe if you lived in East Van, if you certainly lived in Dunbar, maybe you wouldn't have heard about this necessarily going on. Again, the press are never notified that the H Squad is an official thing. So these are just all sort of tangential reports, and as I say, and anecdotal reports that this stuff is happening. It brings us to November 1972. And I'm going to read from this. This was a photo never before published that was found in the police archives, and I managed to find. Police were actually surprised I found it. At 4:30 a.m. on November 25th, 1972, a man named Kirk Brennan reported to police that his 1964 light blue Chevrolet convertible had been stolen from outside his home in East Vancouver. Later that night, a Mrs. L. Matheson, who resided in southeast Vancouver, reported that her Admiral TV had been stolen sometime from her home between November 24th and November 28th, when she'd been away. Neither robbery appeared remarkable. They were typical of auto or property theft calls filed every day with the city police. In 1967, police had responded to 40,000 calls, reports of crimes ranging from murders to fender benders, and that number would double by 1972. No one would have guessed, looking at these mundane and seemingly unrelated thefts, that they would set into motion a series of events resulting in tragic circumstances, the consequences of which are in the minds of some East Vancouverites even today. I can't remember how we found the car, says Gary Blackburn. We stole so many of the damn things back then, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. But that was the big thing back then. You'd steal a car and then break into a house and grab a TV. Blackburn, along with Paul Mello, Danny Teese, and another Clark Park gang member Robert Wadsworth, were all involved in both the car and TV theft that night. What had happened was they had stolen the vehicle, and they went to the Biltmore Hotel, which is still up there today. Although it's no longer a hotel, it's low-income housing, I think. And down at the Biltmore, where the Biltmore Cabaret is today, where you see bands, the pub down there, they went to see if they could find somebody to buy the TV. But they parked the car where the TV was. Actually, I'll just pick up here from the book, actually. Let it explain it. After they stole the TV, they put the Chevrolet, they put it in the Chevrolet and drove closer to the Biltmore Hotel pub, randomly choosing an underground parking lot of a small residential apartment building at 310 East 14th, just off Sophia Street, to park it. The apartment building, still there today, is situated in the quiet neighborhood of Mount Pleasant. Although Main Street has evolved beyond recognition since the 1970s, the surrounding residential streets remain relatively unchanged and are still lined with 2- and 3-story apartment buildings built in the mid to late 1960s. The thieves left the car in the empty parking stall, then walked 3 blocks north of the Biltmore to see if they could find a buyer for the television. As they walked, Blackburn remembers thinking that nothing was out of the ordinary, and the underground parking lot was a good spot for the car. It wasn't likely to be seen, especially that time of the evening. He figured they'd be at the bar for no longer than a couple of hours. The 4 men entered the Biltmore about 8:30 p.m., where they bumped into 2 other Clark Parkers, Rob Thacker and Doug Lewacki, who were drinking and playing pool. While Blackburn, Teese, and Mello were at the Biltmore, the caretaker who lived in the building where they parked the car was busy reading out the license plate to a police dispatcher. He'd spotted the 4 men earlier who were unfamiliar to him and looked suspicious as they left the underground lot. And when he went down to check on the parking area, he found the car didn't belong there. At approximately 9:30 p.m., 2 plainclothes officers were dispatched to check things out at the report of a possible stolen vehicle. In the patrol car was Esko Kajander, who comes back into our story once again. Since the Fraser Street incident in June, Kajander, still working out of the district police office, had been posted in plainclothes duty. That night he was working the evening shift with his senior partner, Ian Batcock, who had joined the police department in 1965. The officers parked their unmarked car, and Kajander walked west down the lane. He went to the underground parking lot and saw the vehicle and confirmed the license plate and spoke to the building manager. Kajander confirmed the car had been reported stolen. The officers radioed back to dispatch that it was the car belonging to Kirk Brennan and noted a TV set was in the back seat. What you did back then was sit on things to wait to see if anything happened, said Kajander, adding that the stolen vehicle had been found without the TV and it might have been towed to the police impound had it not been there. But the TV made police suspect that the thieves would be back to return shortly. Another patrol car was sent to assist Batcock and Kajander, carrying constables Brian Honeyborn and Bruce Campbell, who were on plainclothes duty. The plan was made to sit and wait until the thieves returned. Once they drove the car out, the police would try and block them in the alleyway. The constables split up into pairs. Honeyborn and Campbell parked at the eastern end of the alleyway in front of Mount St. Joseph Hospital on Prince Edward Street, and Kajander and Batcock parked at the west end of the alley on Sophia Street, closer to the entrance of the underground parking lot, at opposite ends of the alley. Men kept in contact via police radio and waited. I thought whoever stolen the car was probably in the Biltmore, probably looking to sell the TV, Honeyborn recalls. We all knew that the Biltmore was a rough place back then, and fencing stolen stuff wouldn't have been out of the ordinary there. Police surveillance can be a mundane task. There are no set rules or traditions, and some insist that the last cop to arrive on location has to bring the coffee and rolls. Depending on the relationship with one's partner, there's all manner of small talk exchanged while sitting in a car. Inter-office police gossip, local sports highlights or jokes to cut the boredom. Sometimes there's just silence, watching and waiting. Time slows down in those moments. You can only look at your wristwatch so many times. After a while, they half expected to be ordered away by dispatch to deal with another incident, but it was a quiet evening and no other emergency calls came through. More than an hour went by. Batcock wanted to call off the surveillance and radio for a tow truck to just take the vehicle to police impound, but the other officers decided to wait a little longer. Eventually, Campbell got out of the car to have a look around. He wandered down the alleyway when he heard a short tap of the horn from Honeybourne, so he ran back to the car. Honeybourne had heard from Cajander that 4 men were coming down Sophia Street and heading into the alley. It was about 10 minutes after midnight when Blackburn, Teese, Mello, and Wadsworth walked back to the stolen car. I sort of had a feeling the cops had staked it out, Wadsworth recalls. Before I went in the underground to get the car, I said something, but the others said to forget about it. The air felt prickly to Gary Blackburn, too. Something didn't feel right. I had those feelings before, I just didn't listen to my senses that night. Wadsworth stayed on the street at the entry of the parkade to keep an eye out while the other 3 went to the car. They tried to cover up the TV with a blanket. 4 scruffy young males driving a good convertible around at that hour of the night with a large TV in the back seat would draw attention. But before they got into the car, Blackburn and Teese flipped a coin to see who would take the back seat. We always switched up so we'd get a chance to, each of us would get a chance to drive the car. And it was Paul's turn. The Chevrolet was a 2-door. You had to push the front seat forward to get in and out of the back. And it was up to me, Danny Teese, as to which of us would sit in the back seat. I lost the flip and had to get in the back with the TV. Up front, Danny sat in the middle. Several minutes after the police had seen the men enter the underground lot, a light above the entranceway suddenly flickered and went out. It was difficult to tell in the darkness if someone had removed it or it simply burned out, but it increased the tension for police, and then the headlights appeared, and Badcock and Cajander saw the Chevrolet quietly glide out of the dark and up the ramp where the man acting as a lookout got in. Cajander and Badcock radioed to Honeybourne and Campbell that the car had exited the lot and was heading down the alley in their direction. After a moment, in order to give the Chevrolet a short head start, Badcock turned into the alley to follow the car. At the other end, Campbell waited until the Chevrolet had almost reached them at Prince Edward Street to turn on the flashing lights, put the car in drive, and quickly turn into the lane. In the back seat, Gary Blackburn noticed the police car lights and the grill of the unmarked car behind them. I turned back, someone yelled police, and there was another car coming right at us, Blackburn says. The doors of the Chevrolet flew open. Everybody jumped out while the car was still moving. Paul and Bob got out of the front seat, but for me to get out of the back, I had to push the seat forward once again. It's a crucial thing. And I was third out of the car. Danny was last as he came up behind me. The Chevrolet slowed and hit the front bumper of Honeybourne and Campbell's car. Honeybourne jumped from the passenger side. Campbell quickly threw the police car into park and leapt from the driver's side and shouted, "Police, stay where you are." He saw the thieves flee towards the adjacent carport, this photo here, at the back of Prince Edward Manor, a 3-story apartment building at 3075 Prince Edward Street. As Campbell shouted, he drew his gun from his hip holster. And started to chase after the men. It had rained in Vancouver 2 days before. Vancouver's rainy season tends to be in full swing in the month of November. There are dozens of wet weather days in any given November in the city, but this one proved particularly unfortunate. It was almost as if the rain had left the roads, sidewalks, and alleyways just wet enough to conspire with Campbell's decision to take out his gun. Because as he chased the thieves, he slipped and lost his footing, and that's when the gun went off. It was the first time in 7 years with the police department that Campbell had fired his gun on the job. Just as I got out of the front of the car, a shot went off near my ear, says Brian Honeybourne. I was about 15 feet away from Bruce. I saw the flash, and I saw him go down. Thinking that Campbell had been hit, Honeybourne took out his gun. Cajander and Badcock also heard the shot, but chasing after the men running into the carport. It was dark, so they couldn't determine the ages of those running, though Badcock thought they looked like young men in their late teens. On the second story of Prince Edward Manor, Richard Underwood was getting into bed when he heard what sounded like a group of people running below his window. Then he heard the first shot. Underwood had experience with guns and hunting rifles, so he knew the different sounds that certain firearms make. He immediately recognized the sound of a small caliber policeman's pistol. Looking out the window, he saw the flashing police lights and heard his neighbor on the floor above him shout, "There's a kid running across the street there." 15-year-old Dorothy Bridgman had just gone to bed in the third-story suite above Underwood's when she heard someone yelling, "Halt," or "Stop." And then she heard a shot, which also woke her mother. They both got out of their beds. When I heard the first shot, I thought, these crazy fuckers are shooting at us, says Gary Blackburn. I heard similar shots before when police on raids in Clark Park had fired warning shots. But says that any time you heard that, you just wanted to run faster. I had no doubt they were shooting directly at us. Mello and Wadsworth had already climbed over a concrete block wall between the two apartment buildings, and Blackburn made it over next. My heart was racing so fast, once I got over, I ran to the other side of the street, says Blackburn. Badcock was trailing after Cajander as they ran into the carport. Danny Teese was halfway over the wall when Brian Honeybourne reached him. I got a hold of him by the scruff, and he went over and tried to drag him back. He spun around and grabbed the barrel of the gun in my right hand. We struggled for a moment. I had my finger on the trigger, and it went off. The bullet flashed with a crack out of the .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. It left the barrel of the gun at nearly 800 feet per second, burning a hole through the sleeve of Teese's red Mac jacket, entering his wrist and scorching a path up Teese's arm before passing on his neck. I yelled at Teese, "Are you hit? Are you hit?" Honeyborn says. I looked and had blood all over my hands. Teese gasped and fell to the ground on his back. Now, what happened that night was the subject of immediate press descended on the scene of the incident up there. Frustratingly enough, Teese, even though he was mere feet away from Mount St. Joseph's Hospital, Mount St. Joseph didn't have an emergency ward, so he had to be transported to VGH. And he was determined to be dead on arrival at VGH. The next day in the Sun, this headline appeared, and Constable Honeyborn was charged with negligence causing homicide. Now, what would happen today with with police administration the way it is now? Maybe the court hearing might happen 2, 3 years later, with the way the court system is. Instead, the preliminary hearing was 2 weeks later. And in a way, I don't want to sort of give away necessarily what happened with the nature of that case, in case you want to read the book. But essentially, it was determined that Teese, being a part of a robbery and whatnot, was sort of the victim of his own demise and whatnot. Now, at the time, in the Georgia Straight, and in another paper called The Grape, that was around then, a sort of counterculture paper, the reporting had essentially been inaccurate. That Honeyborn had lined up as Teese was running and shot him in the back as he was running. And many people, when I was even doing research for the book, still believed that had been the case. And I had to sort of tell them, well, it didn't exactly happen like that. In many ways, I think, as much as some people say there was a cover-up or something like this, I went through this whole thing. I went through a lot of court testimony. I think in the end of the day, this was just a terrible, terrible accident that happened. But at the time, at the effect that happened in East Vancouver, people thought, man, the H Squad are now trying to kill us. And in fact, the H Squad had been disbanded about a month before. It sort of had, or some of the officers had been sort of seconded to other things. But there was this real sort of feeling that this would sort of had been a climax of certain events. For many people who were kids in the Clark Park gang, they didn't, I mean, people might have been scared initially, but many of them sort of continued their ways and ended up going to Haney, going to Ocala, and it took them a few years to in many cases, straighten out. And some of the other members of the Clark Park gang continued their criminal activity, and some of them are dead today from overdoses, some of them were murdered and whatnot. And as for some of the police in the H Squad, many of them continued with the police department, very decorated officers. One of them became a deputy chief, and they continued their lives. The interesting thing is, from the guys that were in the Clark Park gang who are able to tell this story today, and some of them are friends here tonight, and I do say friends because I have friends in the police department, I have friends here that are these gang members, former gang members. You have a situation where you have some good people who did bad things and some bad people who did good things. As I say, many of these young men who got involved with these gangs started from a position of poverty and some family disruption and broken homes that would have been hard to gravitate to anything else. It's amazing, actually, these guys, for everything they've been through, are actually here to tell the tale and can describe sort of what happened. Of course, there are probably a lot of people that even wonder what happened, what the legacy of the H Squad is. There are probably many people, considering some of the gang crime that we see in modern Vancouver today, that might say, let's bring the H Squad back. In fact, the nature of, in any of my conversations with Police Chief Jim Chu or current Police Chief, everybody sort of responds that the gangs are so much more complex than that simply a squad of guys to be rough with these guys may not really be the most effective thing. In fact, the Vancouver Gang Squad now uses some of those techniques of the H Squad. If you're downtown at some nightclubs, you'll see guys very labeled, actually, Vancouver Gang Squad pulling certain people out of nightclubs and banning them from certain places. That's, you know, these are some of the quote-unquote harassment techniques that are used quite commonly today by the Vancouver Police Department. The difference is, and I'm not making excuses for what members of the Clark Park Gang did, or even the H Squad did. These are different times. But the nature of gang crime today in Vancouver, the people who are joining these gangs aren't the kids who grew up at the school of hard knocks and from tough you know, situations and from poverty, who are kind of just looking to get ahead, and if they could steal something here or take a shortcut there, or again, there's a lot of other crimes. There's some very serious robberies, assaults, arsons that are all a part of East Van at that time, whether they were done by people who were Clark Parkers or not. But the gang members today aren't those people. They're kids from middle class or even wealthy homes that are just driven by the greed and avarice of drug dealing. These aren't kids that sort of got together kind of looking out for one another, and because it was no longer safe to be at home when mom and dad were drunk or anything like this. The people that are involved with the young delinquents that are involved with gangs today are a completely different kind of group of people. So I often refer to this period, this park gang era of Vancouver gang crime, as these guys were the dinosaurs before the comet hit. Within a few years, the whole makeup of Vancouver crime changes. Because immigration changes it, that now there's the rise of South Asian gangs, and you know, and the rise of the launch of the narcotics, the sale of narcotics becomes a huge thing that in the 1970s and the 1980s are almost there night and day. I am pleased, though, on a certain note, to at one point, Mac Ryan, who's not here tonight, you know, a lot of the friends of Danny Teese, and Danny, by all accounts, was a kind of a nice kid. He wasn't a leader. He was a follower. He was, of all the people that could have happened to that night, he was probably the least likely candidate. You know, one of the Mac said to me, "Hey, do you ever still talk to Brian Honeyborn, the constable?" And Constable Honeyborn sat down with me in the first interview he's ever done about any of this. He sat down with me the first time and said, "I've never spoken to this before. I've never talked about this with my family. I've never spoken to the media about it, and the only time I'm going to speak to you about it is with you on this." And to hear his side of things and to hear how it affected him personally, that he had been involved with that, was certainly a troubling thing. He wasn't a robot that simply was able to dust it off and never think about it again. He proceeded with his job. He became a very well-respected constable, and is a family guy and a very nice fellow to meet. And it's interesting that some of in the case of Mac Ryan, said, "Hey, if you're talking to Honeyborn, say, hey, no hard feelings." So maybe after 40 years, some of the animosity has washed away. But the interesting thing is, to a certain extent, some people might ask, why write a book about these people? And I'm not necessarily celebrating either side. But for far too long in Vancouver history, we've simply recognized the railroad barons and the property developers. If I hear one more goddamn story about the 3 greenhorns in West Vancouver, in the west end of Vancouver, who bought up some property. Of course, you know, property is still, as today, drives Vancouver. But there's more to the city than that. And you have to figure that in the history of our city, that we've only had Joe Salona, the old prostitution and you know, beer swiller that back in the 1940s as a villain. There's lots of them different in our history, and there's lots of stories in Vancouver history that never get any attention. I think this is one of them. And that sort of concludes, a talk. I was going to say if there's any questions that people had, and there's probably lots of things I skimmed over and whatnot. If you're welcome to ask, and there are some people here that maybe from you guys or from some of the police that are here that I can maybe ask to answer if I can't answer it myself. So. Yeah. Thank you.
take the questions, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
All right. Okay, so let's open the floor up for questions.
Sure,
And,
if anybody had anything,
yeah. All right.
Yes?
I was just wondering about the sign. Was that truly a tattoo that the guys wore at the time, or I've heard rumors that was
Well, that East Van Cross, I don't know if one of you guys wants to answer that. The East Van Cross was something that was sort of seen as graffiti everywhere. Depending on who you ask, it has associated, oh, it's a gang thing that, and a lot of people just wrote it on their school books and stuff like this. The origin of the sign, no one can really seem to figure out who maybe did that first, but it was certainly graffiti that was seen, even today actually, you see it a few, maybe some old time, maybe you guys are writing it on the walls, I don't know. But there's certainly, you still see it in some places today, and in fact, I've even seen a New West version where it's New West cross, that New West getting in on the act. But that sign that now greets people as they enter East Vancouver, that's it was often associated with sort of the rougher elements of East Vancouver, but it was kind of just graffiti that was seen anywhere. It was really the impression that I get in the end. So.
Yeah,